Hi everyone, thank you for that. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Musa. And can I just say, start and just say thank you again to the team at Mocha for organising this wonderful conference. It was on Thursday, I think, that we finally confirmed that we would be coming. And it's truly remarkable to see such a great turnout from a diverse array of people from Yemen, but also just to celebrate the fact that we are able to come together at such short notice. So thank you to the team, to Sheikh Mahmoud and all of the others that were involved in the organisation of this. We really do appreciate it. As Musa said, I'm going to talk a little bit about leadership in times of conflict, but I wanted to first start with perhaps some reflections on why we don't see Yemen up the list on the international agenda. For many years, Yemen has dropped down because of multiple crises around the Middle East and North Africa region. I've spent the last 10 years working on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and if we take the situation in Gaza, naturally the death toll, the destruction, the fact that the UN this week released a report confirming that Israel was indeed committing genocide in Gaza, and the fact that that report has been dismissed by the Israelis, by the Americans, that the invasion of Gaza City continues as we sit here today, the fact that all of that is happening, naturally, Yemen is being put down the list of international priorities. So my point is that when there are so many challenges, particularly for Western governments, it's difficult to address them all. And that's very sad, given yesterday we heard how many hundreds of thousands of people have died in Yemen during the course of the conflict, but also how many have been injured and will face life-changing injuries for the rest of their lives. So I think the point is that it's important that we have discussions like this to put Yemen back on the international agenda. But the war in Gaza and other conflicts there's been a lot of changes in the way that conflict has been fought. If we look at how international law is so flagrantly violated, if we look at the Geneva Conventions, how they're broken throughout the course of the last 2 years, international humanitarian law matters increasingly less. We've seen the destruction of schools, of hospitals and livelihoods, the normalization of starvation as a weapon of war. Another worrying trend is how wars are fought using artificial intelligence. We've seen over the last 2 years how massive numbers of casualties have been created in Gaza through the use of AI in creating lists of targets and the impact that has had on increasing civilian casualties. And then we also see how disinformation is being used. Everything in war now can be used as a weapon, including information. And we see how falsehoods can quickly become truths. And that is very dangerous moving forward in the way that wars will be fought. And as the international rules-based order, or the perception of it is that it's crumbling, we increasingly see that a kind of law of the jungle is in its place, where enforcing international law becomes selective. And we've seen how many governments have condemned Russian aggression in Ukraine, but they hesitate to hold Israel to account. And I think this double standard not only weakens the international rules-based order, but it's also the moral authority of the institutions that were created to prevent wars. If you look at how America is responding to some of the conflicts in the world, particularly Gaza, we see how the American president is using personality to overcome principles. And his approach to international agreements is an example of this. So for Yemen, that creates a lot of challenges. And for you all in the room who care so deeply, as we do, about the people in Yemen, that creates many obstacles for you to get Yemen back on the international agenda. You have fewer levers for outside pressure, and it's a much more difficult task today to mobilize sustained international engagement in conflicts like Yemen, given the multifaceted array of conflicts and challenges that we're all trying to address all at the same time. And if we turn to Europe, Russia's invasion of Ukraine still dominates Europe's strategic agenda. So whilst many security analysts and policymakers see the challenges in the Middle East, the bigger threat that they see is of nuclear Armageddon, where Russia brandishes one of the world's biggest arrays of nuclear weapons. And sadly, that again outweighs some of the focus on the Middle East. At an international level, big power rivalries are also reshaping global politics. The United States versus China dichotomy, where the battle is over trade and technology. The NATO versus Russia conflict is all about security. And so, again, in Europe, rather than a focus on conflict resolution, diplomacy, and mediation, we see the growing increase in military expenditure. So in the UK now, over the next 10 years, GDP will go from 2.5% spend on defence to 5% by 2035. So all of the mechanisms that were once there to solve conflicts, there's going to be a readjustment into, as Oliver mentioned, peace through strength. Another challenge that we're very concerned about is the rise of the far right in politics in Europe, and understanding the extra level of complexity in getting your message across is important if you're going to get Yemen back up the agenda. The far right is now in government in the EU, in Italy, in Finland, in Slovakia, and in Hungary. And if it's not in power, then it's growing in influence. So Marie Le Pen's France's National Rally, the German AfD party, the Netherlands Party for Freedom with Geert Wilders in Poland, and Vox Party in Spain. And if we look across the channel or the pond to the United States, the Make America Great Again movement weaves a lot of the same worldview into its own foreign policy and domestic policy making decisions. So we see in Europe that a lot of the far-right parties will focus very much on anti-migration and anti-Islam. The two together, again, because of where Yemen is and its background, makes it difficult to get the conflict here on the agenda of those people that espouse that worldview. The other thing that we see is mainstream central conservatives trying to outright wing the right wing. Now, the risk is that as those policies move increasingly to anti-migration, anti-Islam, that the far right will just cannibalize those middle-of-the-road conservatives. Why have the diet version when you can have the full fat if you're a voter? So these are all things that make our life much more difficult when we're trying to go into foreign ministries, when we're going into parliaments to put things on the agenda of policymakers, when the domestic priorities are shifting so dramatically away from the region and back into the domestic situation. Another challenge we face is culture wars. So we see how the debate on Israel and Palestine, very important debate on policy, on foreign policy, is reduced to a proxy, a battlefield for far right and the right versus the left, or in this case, Judeo-Christian values versus Islam. And so, again, penetrating through all of this noise is increasingly difficult to get Western support for the situation in Yemen. So I want to talk a bit about leadership now. And I don't want to tell you what to do, but I can explain a little bit about some of the work we do with political leaders to help them, given the current challenges that I've just outlined. We talk a lot about courageous political leadership. So at any stage of a conflict, leaders on all sides have to decide whether they're happy with the way things are or if they want to see a positive change. If you're happy with the status quo, okay, thanks, but often something more. We try and find those leaders that are wanting to change the status quo, that are unhappy with the way things are. They often need some help though, and we work with them to try and build analysis and to find areas of consensus within the communities that they serve that can actually bring all of the communities that they lead on the journey with them, so as few left behind as possible. The other thing that's important for these bold, courageous leaderships is developing internal unity within their group. Movements need to be able to hold together when the external threat or perceived external threat goes. So what I'm saying is leaders have to find a vision that brings all of their group together beyond just the external threat. Because if that threat subsides, suddenly you see a fracturing in the group. We see that with the Israeli government at the moment. The external threat of conflict is something that unifies a lot of the current coalition. So you see an expansion of the war on 7 fronts in Palestine, in Syria, in Lebanon, here in Yemen. And but when that threat subsides, you see how the internal divisions pull governments and leaders apart. We also work with religious leadership, so they can get into the spaces that political leaders can't. If you're accountable only to God, they can take risks that others might avoid, and they can shape codes of ethics and practice that others can follow. And if your enemy, we heard yesterday how the Houthis are framing the conflict in Yemen as a religious conflict. They are framing the conflict in terms of religion, then you also need to be able to tackle in religious terms their arguments. So on the Israeli-Palestinian, about developing a theological underpinning to any sort of political process. So because of the importance of Jerusalem and some of the sacred sites there. And when it comes to religion, you have to help a lot in the West to understand. Secular politicians and diplomats really struggle to understand the religious dimensions of conflict. So I implore you to be patient with them and help them understand, because it's a big blind spot. And then the other thing is leadership also has to be in the small places. As Oliver mentioned earlier, peace agreements on paper are never enough. So the peace has to filter down from the elite level down into the families, the schools, the workplaces, the neighbourhoods. And education and sustained local dialogue are really important in bringing your constituency along that journey with you. And then finally, I have about 1 minute left, is we talked a lot about it, is analysis, getting your analysis right. The average diplomat in Gaza from Europe would spend less than 4 hours in Gaza. And 4 hours to understand a deeply complex history and people. They would go to a youth club, they would go to something else. They wouldn't be engaging inclusively to really understand some of the issues. So naturally, the analysis that was fed back to the capitals was totally misshapen. So as part of our work, we engage inclusively. We engage all actors that have a constituency in the conflict. And it means for us listening to perspectives and things that we may not necessarily agree with. But it's essential to be inclusive in your engagement if you're going to address the root causes of violence. And I will stop there. So it tells me off.
Thank you.